So thank you, first of all, to Spark for the invitation to come and speak this morning. I was delighted to be asked. I think the work that they do is very important, and I was very pleased to be given the chance to come and talk to you, so thank you very much, Louise. And the remit I was given was to talk about the impact of the long-term impact of child poverty on children themselves, okay, using the research not only that I'd done, but other people had done to give some insight into the long-term consequences of poverty. To give you some insight of where I'm coming from, I'm a sociologist. I spent 17 years at the Economic and Social Research Institute. People may have come across that. And part of my job in that every year was that I had to prepare the statistics on poverty and deprivation. It was a very merry job. So every year we'd have to get the data from the Central Statistics Office, and then we'd have to do lots of cleaning, and there was lots of sort of trying to restructure the data. And then every year we would do the analysis of which groups were more likely to experience poverty, so income poverty and deprivation. We had to come up with the measures first, and then every year you would see roughly the same kind of picture that would move with the business cycle, you know? So every year, what you would see is that people who were in the labor force had the lowest levels of poverty, so people who were in a job and working. And the groups that had higher rates of poverty were those who were outside the labor force. Okay? So generally you would see that people with disabilities, but particularly lone parents, every year would be at risk of poverty. And this would not change over time. The risks would go up and down, and so for instance, during the last recession, when there were cuts to social welfare, it was, of course, cuts to the incomes of lone parents that were happening, so that lone parent incomes went down, leading to rates of poverty which were probably, I think, about 250% higher than the working population, or the mean level of poverty. And we see this continually. Now, I was always very interested in the consequences of this, okay? So in terms of the work that I do, I wanted to look at how socioeconomic circumstances of childhood, of the families that people grew up in, influenced their outcomes. Now, I come from a sociological background where I was interested in social reproduction, right? So how the father and the mother of the child, their job and their educations influenced the child's outcomes, but in terms of their own education and job. But I also wanted to see the way that it contributed to longer-term health and well-being, and particularly why we see for members of the population who have, say, less education, live on lower incomes, why do they die earlier? Why are they less healthy while they're alive, and why do they generally age more quickly? Why does this occur? What are the processes, and when does it start? Does it start in childhood? Maybe it even starts in the womb. So that's what I want to do, okay? I'm going to start talking, and I'm going to give you lots of statistics, all right? But don't really think too much about the statistics. I'm going to tell you stories, all right? So I'm going to give you narratives, and I'm going to kind of illustrate those with data from the studies that I do. So are my slides here? No, I can't do that one, can I? I'm going to just quit out of this. Whoop. And I'm going to bring up my presentation here. Is that right? Okay, so here's my presentation, hopefully. Yes. Right. So I'm going to give you lots of data, okay, and I'm going to give you those stories to put those. The data are illustrating stories, and the stories are largely about the long-term impact of child poverty on outcomes for the child, okay, because it is a pattern that we see across all societies where we've looked, that economic position is associated with lower life expectancy and with worse health during life. And the more we've done research, the more we've seen that this starts really on in life. That child development is this subtle interaction of the child's own physiology with their environment. That the environments that they're exposed to are shaping not only their physiological development, that is the rate at which they grow and the kind of body that they develop, the very musculature, the very bones, the physiology of their bodies, but also their own emotional and psychological makeup, their ability to make relationships with others, and the consequences that has not only for their own well-being in terms of health, but also for their ability to make those relationships which are going to be vitally important to them in terms of living happy, fulfilled lives and contributing to their families and their communities. So this subtle interaction starts really early. And what we know is that poverty is toxic to that. That poverty leads to poorer development across a number of those different dimensions with long-term consequences. And I put some up there: educational failure, unemployment, poverty, criminality. Okay, these are all costs on our society. They are unfulfilled potential. These are things we will end up paying for. And in a sense, the primary message that I'm talking about today is that what we should be doing is starting earlier, intervening earlier to prevent these things occurring, not trying to remediate or remediate later on, not trying to spend money trying to deal with damaged young people or adults who've been through these experiences. Why not get to the heart of the problem and intervene earlier so they're not experiencing the poverty that contributes to these things? So, just before I start giving you some statistics, let's put this within a little bit of context in the Irish society. Government knows these things, okay? Government has lots of reports from not only people like me, but others who know much more about the policy environment. And this was the outcome of a long consultation process. This comes from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. We know it colloquially as BOBF. Many of you may have come across BOBF, but it's Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures. And here what you've got is a policy framework which is actually really insightful, builds upon a lot of the research done in other countries, uses the Irish research which is available, and shows that we need to do a number of things if we're to improve outcomes for young people, for children, and then actually for society overall at large. We need to support parents, intervene early, listen and involve young people, provide quality services, strengthen transitions, and cross-government coordination. Okay? All of those things are true. But what we also need to do is make sure that people have living standards and levels of resources available to them that allow them to live these lives, which are of the right kind of level. Okay? Of course, it's not just an Irish development. This idea of looking at early life has been seen across a number of different countries. The UK government, particularly under the Blair administration, put a lot of energy into this and developed from 2004 the Every Child Matters process that actually led to some really important legislation, the Child Poverty Act from 2010, which was looking to eradicate child poverty essentially by 2020. Now that kind of hit the buffers. It was initially very, very successful. Very, very high rates of poverty reduction that kind of petered out as they got to the sort of hard end of the problem after a number of years. That process was kind of continued to a certain extent under Cameron's government, and we had a number of reports coming from notables, Michael Marmot in 2010, that Fair Society, Healthy Lives, concentrated on a lot of around healthy lives. You even had reports from sort of cross-party reports from people, from MPs, Graham Allen and David Willits, looking at issues around early life and how they impacted on individuals, and this notion that we should intervene early. It was not lost, okay? They understood the literature, they understood the processes. But nonetheless, through all this, we constantly saw these messages that it wasn't about resources, it wasn't about providing families with the money and with the environments that they needed to be able to parent effectively. It was actually just about parenting itself that could be detached in some sort of fashion. That what you had to do was either compel people to be better parents or teach them to be better parents, because it was the parenting that was at fault. Now, I'm not underplaying the importance of parenting. I know parenting matters. I have 3 kids myself. I've been a rubbish parent in the past, and I realized I got better as I did it. I know that we could all learn to be better parents, okay? But what I do know from the research is that parents don't parent within a vacuum or within some kind of space that is not constrained by resources. Resources matter. And that's why I've just put this quote up here from David Cameron, because this is the sort of essential ideology of a lot of government policy, that it's about trying to influence parenting rather than trying to provide the proper context for parenting. So he says, children born in poverty and those born in wealth achieve similar outcomes as long as they were brought up by confident and able parents. Now, to a certain extent, that's true, okay? Positive parenting can be done within a context where there's very few resources. It is true, this can happen. But what we know is that it's much less likely to occur, and parents have to work a great deal harder to parent properly in an environment where they're very short on resources. Okay, now I want to, given all that, and after setting out the message, what I want to do now is I just want to show you in the next, say, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, how poverty influences long-term child outcomes, okay? And we have to think about this in terms of a number of different processes. So the first thing I just want to show you is that that poverty makes a difference, okay, in terms of inequalities in health. Child health is influenced by the economic and social environments that children are brought up in. And I just want to show that here, instead of just sort of saying poverty in everybody else, I just want to show this here in terms of what we would call the gradient in health, all right? And the gradient in health is a constant that we see across different societies. It is steeper in some societies and shallower in others. But what it shows is that there is a relationship between the income position of the household and the health of the child. These are data from growing up in Ireland at age 3 years and at 9 years. And as you can see, the bars here, in terms of percentage of parents reporting a health condition, a long-standing health condition for their child, the bars are taller at the poorer end of the distribution, all right? So the poorer a parent is, we see these are quintiles, these are fifths, if you like, of the income distribution. And the bars are tallest when we're at the lowest end, and they're smallest when we're at the higher end. And as the child gets older, the gradient gets steeper, all right? That itself, in a sense, is going to give us a hint about what the processes are that contribute to this. So this is just to show you that there are inequalities from early age. Here we're saying at least 3 years in terms of child health inequalities by household income. So how early does this start? Is it before 3 years? What this shows you is that if we look at the children who are born low birth weight, that's under 2,500 grams, you see gradients by income group 2. So you're seeing from the very time that they emerge screaming into the world, though actually low birth weight children don't tend to scream when they enter the world. They have very low APGAR scores and they tend to be quite immobile. But what we see is that the gradient is well established at this point. In fact, it's a very high inequality. You can see rates are almost double for the lowest income group compared to the highest income group in terms of low birth weight children. And that has consequences. These are data on, it's been sort of clipped at the top, but these are data on children reaching milestones. So these are children failing developmental milestones. We have them from 9 months in the Growing Up in Ireland survey, Growing Up in Ireland data. And so you've got 5 different, these are 5 different, if you like, tests which are done on the children at 9 months. And you've got the proportions who are failing. And what this is basically showing you is compared to the not low birth weight, the low birth weight children, which are the orange columns, those columns are taller, aren't they? And they're taller because you've got more children failing who are low birth weight. That low birth weight child is much more likely to have developmental issues from early on. Now, many will catch up, okay? Many will attain similar outcomes in the long term than the children who are not low birth weight. But when we tested children at 9 years and 13 years and 17 years, we see deficits on a number of dimensions still from those low birth weight children, and the low birth weight children are much more likely to be poor when they were born. There are long-term consequences of being born into a household who are poor. So if we're looking across the life course, how do these processes happen? How does this occur? What are the how can we think about this complex phenomenon, if you like, of child development? Because you have to think of the influence of background on children as being happening through a large number of possible pathways. There are multiple kinds of exposures that could have an effect. So a lot of research has been done to try to put together good evidence about what they might be, because that's the basis upon which we can subsequently intervene. You know, it's only once we have good understanding, it's only once we have good data, hard evidence about this, that we can actually sit down and design interventions to be able to improve things. So I'm going to put forward to you 3 stories, all right? I'm going to call these hypotheses about how early life exposure to poverty influences long-term outcomes. And there's going to be loads of graphs and data, okay, but essentially just go with the story. It's about the narratives involved. Each of them is supported by evidence. Each of them actually occurs. It's not about one of these, it's about all of these. Some are more important than others, although the extent to which they are more important than others is still hotly debated, and it's something which I'm going on doing research about. All right, so I've got 3 stories. One is called a critical periods hypothesis. This is the notion that adult inequalities in health, adult outcomes, are a consequence of children being exposed during a really critical period in their development, usually seen as being in the first 3 years of life, sometimes in a period up to 3 months of age. Right? This is seen as a critical period when the child is uniquely plastic. The child is uniquely vulnerable to experience of poverty. So that's one kind of hypothesis, that once exposed, that's it. This is locked in, and it leads to long-term consequences for the child. So that's one hypothesis, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second one's going to be the accumulation of risk. Here, rather than it being one exposure at a point in time when they're uniquely vulnerable, here you've got a sort of slow rain of adversity on children. It's like, you know, the environment, many different dimensions of the environment are all contributing to poorer outcomes. And some children have, of course, exposure to many more poorer environments, and those children are more likely to be poor. Okay, and here you get this accumulation of risk across the life course that leads to these poorer outcomes overall. And the last one here is what I'm going to call health selection. And here what you've got are processes that are associated with poverty that push children onto a particular trajectory that has long-term consequences for them. All right, so deep breath now. We're going to have to go through quite a lot of figures and charts here, but it's well worth it to get a good understanding of how the complex interaction of different factors work to produce these poor outcomes for kids. So first of all, the critical periods hypothesis. I just put this up here as one of the sort of key studies or rather key historical events that led us to be able to do quite insightful studies of the impact of a critical period effect on children's long-term development. These are pictures from the Dutch hunger winter. In the autumn and winter of 1944, as the Allies had come in via Normandy, they were pushing up into the Netherlands, and they wanted to cut off the Germans. So they landed airborne troops into the Netherlands, and the Dutch resistance wanted to try to help them, so they blew up loads of railways. The Germans did not take kindly to this, and then cut off all food supplies into the Netherlands. So from about September 44 through to about February 45, the Dutch population starved, and the Germans really didn't care. And what this led to was a unique experiment where essentially a very affluent society experienced starvation during a particular period that was then lifted. And so children who were either being conceived during that period or they were in the latter sort of trimesters of gestation, they were uniquely kind of exposed. Now, this was a disaster and a tragedy, and it caused a lot of heartache, but from a scientific perspective, it's really, really interesting. Because, of course, what you've got here is this kind of natural experiment where you take a population that weren't experiencing deprivation and you expose them to deprivation, and then you can follow those kids up in the long term. And God bless the Dutch, they have really good information systems, so they can go back to these people through their lives, as they did. And what they found was really interesting, that this critical period during gestation really mattered for the long-term health of those populations. So, for example, children who were being exposed during their first trimester, they had insulin response that was impaired for the rest of their life, essentially, with long-term consequences. So insulin response is one of the factors which contributes to the experience of type 2 diabetes and to cardiovascular disease. So you would see higher rates here of heart failure and of the complications of diabetes for these children all the way through their lives. Also, exposure to an environment where there was low levels of protein available meant that these children laid down inadequate organs within their bodies, because their bodies, living off the resources of their mothers, simply didn't have the nutrients available to be able to build the kind of bodies that they were going to need for the rest of their lives. Therefore, some organs that were more exposed to this, notably things like kidneys, they put down less nephrons, which are the cells that do the processing of the urea, which means that those, or it cleans the blood, and those children were then exposed in their later life to higher blood pressure as their kidneys, which were of a smaller scale and not as effective, began to break down. So you see here a critical period. You know, during a particular period of their gestation, they were exposed to circumstances that had long-term consequences, and they simply never recovered from this. So you have an exposure and consequences. It's quite simple in many ways, and there's been some good science to show how this worked. I want to show another one from the Irish context. This is about the exposure of children to smoking in the womb. So we were looking at the way that smoking was distributed across the population in growing up in Ireland. And what these bars show you is that these are social class groups, so each column's a social class. You've got the professional managers on the left, and then you get increasingly they become white collar, and then across non-manual groups to manual groups on the right. And what you see is that the smaller the yellow grouping, which is at the top of the bars, okay, the more people who are smoking. And the blue grouping at the bottom of each column, that's heavy smoking, right? And what that shows you is that you see more smoking, the more manual the groups, and you also see the line that's cutting across the middle of the chart? That line is the experience of what we might call conduct problems in those children at 9 years of age. So if we follow those children through from birth to 9 years, we see that some are more likely to experience emotional, externalizing behaviors and conduct issues, both at home and in school. And we have reports from both the teacher and the parent to be able to look at this with. Now, the question is there a relationship between these things? Is it that there's some effect of smoking in the womb, which is then, or rather in pregnancy, which is then impacting on the children's long-term development? It's a hard one to try to pull out because children who are poor actually have other risks of conduct disorder via other processes completely. They are multiply exposed. But the smoking, okay, has its own effects. And if you do the statistics, if you do some sort of fancy stuff to try to sort out the causal structures here, what you find is that actually there is an identifiable independent effect of the smoking itself, which is a critical period effect on the children's brain development that leads to this impact of smoking. And here what you can see is this is how the experience of conduct disorder ramps up with the mother's smoking during pregnancy. So this is after we strip out everything else. What we know is that there is a critical period effect of smoking during pregnancy that has long-term consequences. Now, what I'm not trying to do here is I'm not trying to demonize mothers who smoke. Okay? When you do research amongst mothers who smoke, what you realize very quickly is that smoking in pregnancy actually is part of a constellation of risk factors for the mother, usually associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety and poor circumstances during pregnancy and prior to pregnancy. Most people who smoke don't do it because they feel it's good for the child. They realize the consequences. Nonetheless, they smoke anyway with consequences for the child. I think it's important to realize that, to see the types of factors that contribute to poor outcomes for children and the way that those factors are related back to the circumstances, the social and economic circumstances of the people themselves. These risk factors for child development and for later disease, they start early, as I've shown you. Smoking in pregnancy is the biggest contributor to preterm birth and to low birth weight, those factors that I showed you earlier on. All right, so that's the critical period effect. I've got about another 10 minutes, haven't I, Louise? Yeah, okay, so we'll do this real quickly. Accumulating effects. So there are these kind of critical period effects, but we also know that children, poor children, are exposed to these environments where you get this pitter-patter raining of risk factors onto them that contribute to poor outcomes for them. And I just want to give you some sort of examples of that. This is a little bit of a difficult chart to look at, but essentially what it's showing you is that 15 minutes. Okay, well, that's good. Thank you. What we know is that children who are coming from those low-income families, as I've showed you, they're lighter, aren't they, at birth? And this shows you the difference between the professional class, which is that sort of horizontal, thick black line in the middle. This is the difference in weight for kids in different social classes relative to the professionals at 3 points in time, at birth, at 9 months, and 3 years. And what you see is that the children from those low-income groups, they are lighter at birth. As I've showed you, they're more likely to be low birth weight. But look, they quickly converge at 9 months with the children of the professionals. So by 9 months, they're about the same weight, that they grow more quickly. But then they overshoot, and they keep on growing. So that by 3 years of age, they're now significantly heavier, particularly, and you can see there's a gradient in the social class effect. So that the more manual they are, and then the more, particularly the semi and unskilled, they're putting on weight quicker. Now you might say, oh, that's fantastic. That's really good, Richard, they're catching up. But actually that's not. What we want in children is slow, steady creation of body structures. It's like a tree. Okay, an oak tree that grows slowly and puts down dense wood, that's going to be a really strong tree that's going to live for 1,000 years. A tree that grows quickly, that lays down wood, but very undense wood, is itself very vulnerable and grows quickly, but is using a different strategy for survival. It's going to grow quickly, die young. Okay, and that's exactly what happens with children when they grow quickly like this. And we've done analysis that shows the factors which are contributing to this, why they're growing more quickly. And they're growing more quickly often because of differential exposure to breastfeeding and weaning practices in the household, and then into the diets that they subsequently get after they've been weaned onto solids. So they're experiencing lower levels of breastfeeding early on, and they're being weaned earlier onto solid foods. So this is looking at the same class, different class groupings, and what we're looking at here are the proportion who are being breastfed, any breastfeeding at all, and then those who are being weaned after 5 months, which is standard guideline. In a sense, you breastfeed until 6 months, and then you transfer onto solid foods, okay? You can have complementary feeding at that point, but that's the WHO guideline, the World Health Organization guideline. And as you can see, there's a gradient in this. And when we come to do the analysis of the factors which are contributing to those quicker growth rates, a lot of it is a function of breastfeeding and weaning practices in the household or that the child's been growing up in. So we can get a good idea as to the factors which are contributing here, and you can see that this is an accumulation, that's pitter-patter of risk factors on these children which are contributing to worse health later on. This is going to contribute to of course, the children who are they're putting on weight more quickly, they are accumulating weight, but they're actually shorter, the lower social class kids. So they are significantly shorter than their peers. So they're shorter and they're fatter, which means that they're more likely to be overweight and obese, and that's strongly then correlated with long-term risks of cardiovascular disease and that kind of metabolic syndrome that I pointed to earlier on, insulin resistance, which is going to lead to longer-term problems for them. All right? All right, the last one then is the health selection problem. Here, health selection process. And here I want to draw upon effects that we've done analyses of both in Britain and in Ireland, and they are largely about the impact of recession on kids. So the experience that we've all had since 2007 has been pretty horrific. I don't need to tell you that. It's been something of a trauma for the country. Some people, of course, were more affected by that trauma than others as we went into recession, but the country's been through an enormous shift, in a sense, an enormous impact of the economy collapsing and the financial stress that put onto families. And more through luck than anything else, we had data from the Growing Up in Ireland study before the recession, and then we had data during the depths of the recession, and then we had data as they came out of recession. And this gives us a unique insight into the child's and the family's experience of recession and the impact it had on the children. So I've done quite a lot of work looking at the impact not only on the children's health, but also on their educational development, on their psychological development, and we can follow them through time. Again, it's sort of like an unhappy natural experiment with the population of Ireland, you know, that we're taking our kids and we're kind of exposing them to this. Now, as I say, I've done quite a lot of research on that, but what I want to show you actually is some research using data from the UK, about the impact of low income on child development. Just before I do that, I just want to tell you, use a study from the US that contextualizes how recessions impact on families and children, and this notion about the pathway selection that I talked about, the way how that occurs and why that might contribute to children's long-term outcomes. Because I've given you these kind of physiological processes, haven't I? I've spoken to you about the way that the child's physiology is shaped by experience of poverty. And I've showed you how that can contribute to differences in psychological characteristics. Do you remember conduct disorder and the sort of emotionality of those children, how that occurs? But actually, it can also, the poverty can also have effects of pushing people into different pathways via the kind of situations they're exposed to, the choices they then make. And that's a wholly social or psychosocial process, not a physiological one, but nonetheless is really important in terms of children's outcomes. And the classic study here is a really brilliant study from a guy called Glenn Elder, who did the study in the mid-1960s, but it used data from the Great Depression in the US. And so the name of the book is The Children of the Great Depression. And his book from 74 followed those children who were in the Oakland Growth Study, who collected data on them. They were about 10 years old at the time, in 1932, and then they subsequently collected it sort of 5-year intervals, all the way through to he did the book in 74 on data by the mid-1960s, but they went on following them after that. And what was really interesting there was that these exposure to the Great Depression had effects on those children that were really important in terms of their subsequent life course experiences. So you had boys, for instance, who were coming from poorer households, or even middle-class households that experienced deprivation during the Great Depression. What you had was they were more likely to choose certain educational tracks than others. All right? So they, instead of going for the sort of higher value academic tracks that were going to give them sort of a long-term better jobs and higher incomes, they were going for vocational tracks that gave them a more payback and a steady job earlier. They were sort of going for the safe option rather than the high earning options. Middle-class girls trying to get out of their recession hit or their depression hit households, marrying early, often to poor matches. This, of course, was the 1930s, so there weren't that many career options for girls at that point. So they would use it, this was forcing them into making decisions to get them out of households. And you had this renegotiation of gender roles, which was a long-term impact on many of those children, some of which may have contributed to some of the changes that we saw in American society during the 1960s. Really impactful events, not only on the individuals, but on the society overall. These had long-term echoes down through American society. So what you've got here are psychosocial pathways where experiences at one point in time push people onto another track that has long-term consequences for them. And if you're going onto a track with a lower income possibilities, if you're going onto tracks, say a bad marriage that ends up being abusive, that has consequences for you that can have health consequences and psychological consequences, and of course, quality of life consequences in terms of happiness. So I'm not going to try to talk you through that, but what I am going to do is then take you to some research that we've done at using data from the UK. This is using Millennium Cohort, which is kind of the comparator data set for growing up in Ireland from the UK. It was a national sample from all of the countries of the UK, Northern Ireland included, and it's 18,000 children followed across time. And here what we can look at is the way that exposure to low income and poverty increases how that impacts on the child's development. And I'm sort of harking back here to the sort of Glenn Elder study and showing how the experience of poverty shapes the child's experience in the household. And it's via the stress experience of the parents. So the process is this. Parents who are experiencing low income, they're doing their best to make the most of the resources they've got. But like all of us, the experience of low income is stressful. What it does is you're trying to make ends meet. You want to buy food this week, but you haven't got quite enough resources. You've got to make the rent, but you haven't got quite enough money for it. This is producing, we could call it economic strain, okay, but the consequence of it is psychological distress. You know this as much as I do. It's something we all experience. But of course, if you're constantly under economic strain, then you're going to get more of this kind of experience. Adults experiencing psychological distress will externalize in much the same way as children do. So you know what it's like. If you are stressed, you tend to be a little bit more short with your partner, don't you? Or with those who are around you, maybe your children. You're a bit less warm. You're less likely to sort of give them cuddles and to be sort of nice and sort of tolerant of them. You're going to be more snappy. And that's exactly what we see in the data from Millennium Cohort. When we look at the experience of children, parents are more likely to have psychological distress, and that impacts on their levels of warmth with their children and the levels of hostility that they display to their children and to their partners. And this ramps up with the number of years poor. So you can see this here in this chart. The horizontal axis is the number of years poor. So this is the number of years that they're under essentially UK poverty lines. And as that goes up, you can see that the blue line, which is maternal psychological distress, that goes up. At the same time, maternal warmth is going down. Okay, so the more she's exposed to these poor environments, the more her ability to parent effectively goes down. The quality of her relationship to partner, where there was a partner, goes down. So the household becomes a much more difficult place to parent effectively in. And with the best will in the world, you see that parents, even when you've got these well-educated professional parents, when they were exposed to economic strain, and we see this in Ireland during the Great Recession, what you see is that even those well-educated, able parents become worse parents. They become less warm. They become short with their children. They become more inconsistent in their parenting. And this takes us right back to that point I was making earlier on about the quote from David Cameron, that you can put emphasis on parenting if you like, and you can prioritize parenting, you can teach people to be good parents, but you've still got to provide them with the resources that they can actually parent effectively. Because nobody is going to be the parent that they could be if they're poor and if they're stressed and if they're unhappy. And that has real implications for the policies that you then adopt. It has long-term economic, educational consequences for the children. So I just wanted to show you this, that as the mother becomes more stressed and obviously unhappier, the number of years poor here also impacts on the child's cognitive development. We have standardized scales, and you can see the level of cognitive development decreasing over time. You can see the level of psychological adjustment of the children going down. They're beginning to externalize and have depressive symptoms themselves. And you also see educational performance dipping down. Okay, so they do worse in school. This is going to be a pathway effect. Because they're doing worse in school, they're going to be less likely to get the qualifications they need to be able to go on to high levels of education, and they're going to get worse jobs, and you're going to see a reproduction of social position through time as they experience more unemployment and poverty themselves. And then that is visited upon their own children. It's an intergenerational reproduction of social position. Okay, what's the policy implications of these things? Well, here's some just quotes from Joost Esping Andersen at the top there, which is really about, in a sense, that reproduction of social position idea. That if the race is already halfway run, even before children begin school, then we clearly need to examine what happens in the earliest years. Intervene early if children are going to experience worse outcomes later on. Make sure that the circumstances of their lives are improved earlier on. And we don't tend to do that in Ireland. If you look at other countries, they invest more earlier in children. Okay, so this is, I'm going to show you some data from an OECD study. Dominic Richardson did it, and it's called Doing Better for Children, where they brought together a lot of the evidence about impacts of circumstances on children's development, and they also looked at the policies which are developed, and they saw how children varied across countries in terms of their outcomes. And what they found was that early investment in children, I hate to use that word investment, okay, but often that's a word that sort of governments understand and economists understand more than this idea of, providing healthy, happy households. But what they found was that some countries invested earlier in children. So here's Sweden, okay, and you can see here, this is the level of investment in children. So the higher the line, okay, the more investment that's happening, and the higher the line earlier in their age, because that's prenatal period on the left, over to age 27 on the right, This shows you, in a sense, the front loading of the level of investment. You can see in Sweden, they're investing in that first year of life. It peaks, basically, in the first year of life. They initially get the resources into the household after the children's born. Make sure there's a good environment there for the children. And then you keep investing. There's a bit of a dip between one and say, 2, and then it comes up again as they maintain, and there's a slight ramping up as they go through their teenage years and into higher education. Then it drops away. I will, exactly that. You see the same thing in Iceland. They take a very similar approach, investment earlier on. But what do we see in Ireland? We see a very different picture. We see lack of investment earlier on. We see a lower investment across those first 10 years of life, but particularly in the first 3 years of life. And that has consequences for the children. So, here's my favorite quote that I've used a number of times, and many of you have probably already seen me say it, but it's the sort of takeaway note from this, and the overall sort of piece of advice that you'd give to government. If people keep falling off a cliff, don't worry about where you put the ambulance at the bottom. Build a fence at the top, stop them falling off in the first place. It's much cheaper and more effective. Thank you very much.